Long before the first landing craft struck the sands of Omaha Beach, the war for Normandy was being lost in the mind of one man, Adolf Hitler. The Führer's catastrophic underestimation of the United States was not a simple strategic miscalculation, it was a profound and deeply held conviction, born from the toxic synthesis of his racial ideology and fatally flawed military intelligence. To Hitler, America was not a sleeping giant but a degenerate, culturally hollow nation, incapable of the discipline, sacrifice, and martial prowess required for total war. This foundational belief, solidified in the early years of the conflict, would create a strategic blind spot so vast that it would ultimately swallow the Third Reich whole. The origins of this fatal arrogance reveal a worldview impervious to reality, one that would look at the world's greatest industrial power and see only weakness. The core of Hitler's contempt for America was ideological, stemming directly from the perverse racial theories of National Socialism. He viewed the United States as a chaotic, mongrelized nation, a stark contrast to his vision of a racially pure and disciplined Aryan superstate. In his mind, the American melting pot had produced not strength through diversity, but a fatal corruption of blood and spirit. He saw a nation weakened by its significant Jewish and black populations, groups he considered inherently inferior and corrosive to societal strength. This prejudice was not merely private sentiment, it was a cornerstone of his strategic thinking. In a chillingly clear statement from January 1942, Hitler laid bare his view: "I don't see much future for the Americans, it's a decaying country. And they have their racial problem, and the problem of social inequalities. Everything about the behavior of American society reveals that it's half Judaized, and the other half negrified. How can one expect a state like that to hold together?" This single quote encapsulates his entire diagnosis. To Hitler, the presence of these racial groups was not a feature of American society but a terminal illness. The terms Judaized and negrified were, in his vocabulary, synonyms for cultural decay, materialism, and a lack of martial virtue. He believed such a populace could never be forged into an effective, unified fighting force comparable to his battle-hardened Wehrmacht. This conviction made it impossible for him to conceive of America as a serious military threat. He saw a nation of consumers, not soldiers, of jazz musicians, not warriors. It was a fundamental misreading of the American character, but one that fit perfectly within his self-affirming ideology, assuring him that this transatlantic power was of little ultimate consequence. This ideological disdain was dangerously reinforced by the intelligence reports that reached his desk. The German Military High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, provided assessments that seemed to confirm the Führer's every prejudice. In a pivotal intelligence summary presented in December 1940, Colonel Walter Warlimont painted a picture of an American industry utterly unprepared for the rigors of war. The report characterized American factories as overwhelmingly designed for consumer goods, implying that a nation focused on producing refrigerators and automobiles could not possibly pivot to mass-producing tanks and bombers on the scale required. This analysis laughably missed the very essence of American industrial might, its unparalleled capacity for mass production, regardless of the product. Even more revealing was the German interpretation of America's labor force. The same report noted the increasing involvement of women in military production, but instead of seeing it as a sign of total societal mobilization, the German analysts interpreted it as a fundamental weakness of the labor force. In the rigid, patriarchal worldview of the Third Reich, the place for women was in the home, producing children for the Reich. Seeing American women on the factory floor was, to them, proof that the nation lacked able-bodied men, a sign of desperation, not resilience. This assessment was not just wrong, it was a projection of their own societal values onto a nation they fundamentally misunderstood. They saw weakness where, in fact, lay one of America's greatest hidden strengths. The cumulative effect of this biased ideology and flawed intelligence can be vividly imagined in a scene from the winter of 1941. In the crisp mountain air of his Berchtesgaden retreat, the Führer sits, leafing through the latest intelligence summaries. His eyes, burning with self-satisfaction, scan the numbers that confirm his worldview. The United States Army, the reports tell him, is ranked a pathetic 17th in the world, its forces outnumbered by even those of Romania. A contemptuous smirk likely crosses his face. How could this half-European mongrel race, a nation distracted by internal squabbles and racial impurity, possibly challenge the destiny of the Great Reich? In that moment of supreme hubris, surrounded by the granite peaks of the Alps, the seeds of his ultimate downfall were sown. He was blind to the reality that the very factories he dismissed were tooling up for the greatest explosion of military production in human history, and the weak nation he derided was about to unleash a storm of steel that would sweep his thousand-year Reich into oblivion. As the dawn of June 6, 1944, broke over Europe, it illuminated a continent cleaved in two. On the storm-tossed shores of Normandy, the largest amphibious invasion in human history was in violent, chaotic motion. Men and machines poured onto the beaches in a deluge of steel and courage. But hundreds of miles away, at the Berghof, Hitler's Alpine retreat, an unnatural calm prevailed. There, a deathly silence hung in the corridors of power, a silence more damning than the roar of any artillery barrage. While the fate of his empire was being decided, the one man whose every whim was law, the man on whom the destinies of millions depended, was fast asleep. The history of the Second World War had reached its hinge point, and Adolf Hitler, the architect of the conflict, was blissfully, catastrophically, unconscious. The situation was a paradox of absolute power and absolute paralysis. The Führer's routine had collided with the Allied timetable, and the routine had won. The previous night, he had stayed up late, not poring over maps or anticipating an invasion, but in relaxed conversation with his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels. It wasn't until 3 a.m. that he finally retired to his bedroom, having taken a sleeping draught to ensure a deep and undisturbed rest. The order was ironclad and understood by all: the Führer was not to be disturbed. As the first, frantic reports of paratrooper landings began to filter in around 4 a.m., his adjutants were faced with an unthinkable choice. In their hands, telephone receivers trembled, carrying fragmented, terrifying messages of a full-scale assault unfolding on the French coast. Every instinct screamed that the commander-in-chief must be informed. Yet, the fear of Hitler's wrath, a force more immediate and terrifying than any enemy army, held them in its grip. No one dared to knock on that door. Imagine the scene: outside the Führer's private quarters, a small group of high-ranking officers stands frozen in a state of suspended crisis. The air is thick with unspoken panic. Every tick of the clock is a countdown to disaster. The teletypes chatter incessantly, spitting out communiques about thousands of ships and waves of bombers. They know that panzer divisions sit idle, awaiting the one order only Hitler can give. They know that Field Marshal Rommel is away on leave, and that the entire command structure in the West is looking to them for direction from the very top. But the man behind the door is sacrosanct. To wake him would be to invite a torrent of rage for disturbing his slumber with what might, in his view, be a mere feint or a minor raid. In the toxic ecosystem of the Third Reich, delivering bad news was a career-ending, and sometimes life-ending, mistake. And so, for 7 critical hours, the German war machine in France was headless. It was not until 11 a.m., long after the initial Allied beachheads had been bloodily secured, that Hitler finally emerged. When his aides at last summoned the courage to inform him of the morning's events, his reaction was not one of panic or alarm, but of breathtaking arrogance. According to a widely circulated account of the moment, a triumphant, almost gleeful expression spread across his face. Far from seeing the invasion as a crisis, he saw it as a divine opportunity. He allegedly exclaimed, "Excellent! Now we can get to them." In his mind, the Allies had not successfully breached Fortress Europe, they had foolishly thrown themselves into a trap of his own making. He remained utterly convinced that their forces, now confined to the coast, could be easily annihilated, their foothold in France swiftly erased. This single, reported utterance reveals more than 1,000 strategic documents. It is the voice of a leader so insulated by ideology and sycophancy that he had become completely detached from reality. He heard news of a massive, coordinated invasion involving thousands of vessels and over 100,000 men and interpreted it as a tactical gift. He did not grasp the scale, the power, or the resolve of the force that had just landed. He was still fighting the imaginary, degenerate America from his own racist fantasies, not the industrial colossus that was at that very moment establishing an unbreakable lodgment on the continent. As he spoke those confident words, the sun was already high in the sky over Normandy, and the window to repel the invasion was rapidly closing. History had arrived while he was sleeping, and his awakening had come far too late. While Adolf Hitler awoke to a reality he had deemed impossible, the true nature of the Allied achievement was being tallied not in strategic gains, but in the cold, hard currency of war, numbers. The figures that began to coalesce in the frantic reports reaching German High Command on June 6, 1944, were more than just statistics, they were the mathematical proof of a new kind of warfare, one waged on a scale so vast it defied comprehension. This was not a battle, it was an industrial event, a logistical miracle that rendered Germany's years of preparation and ingrained sense of superiority obsolete in a matter of hours. For a command structure that had been fed a steady diet of propaganda about American weakness, the sheer, staggering arithmetic of Operation Overlord was a psychological blow from which it would never recover. The initial shock came from the sheer mass of humanity that had been transported across the treacherous English Channel in a single day. On June 6 alone, 1:15 Allied soldiers set foot on Norman soil. This was not a raiding party or a probing force, it was the population of a significant city, moved and deployed under fire in less than 24 hours. The assault was multidimensional. Even before the first landing craft hit the sand, the invasion had begun from the sky, with 400 elite airborne troops descending into the darkness behind enemy lines. Among them, 4,000 arrived in silent, ghostly gliders, sowing chaos and securing vital bridges and crossroads. The scale of this initial airborne wave alone was larger than many entire battles fought earlier in the war. It was a clear statement of intent, the Allies were not just coming to fight on the coast, they were seizing the hinterland from the very first moment. This human wave was carried to France by a naval force of unprecedented size. Nearly 7,000 vessels, a flotilla so vast that it created a veritable bridge of steel across the channel, participated in the operation. This armada comprised everything from mighty battleships whose guns pounded the coastal defenses to the thousands of small landing craft that delivered men directly onto the beaches. On board this fleet was a total of 287,000 personnel, a number that included not just the combat infantry but the sailors, engineers, medics, and logistical staff required to sustain such a monumental undertaking. The German Navy, or what was left of it, was utterly powerless in the face of such overwhelming maritime supremacy. Above this armada, the skies belonged to the Allies. Over 11,000 aircraft formed a protective umbrella and an offensive spearhead, ranging from heavy bombers that had been pulverizing infrastructure for weeks to the fighter planes that strafed any German defenders who dared to show themselves. This airborne fleet guaranteed that the Luftwaffe could offer no meaningful resistance, leaving German ground troops exposed, isolated, and terrified by the constant threat from above. The combination of total sea and air control created a hermetically sealed corridor through which the Allied invasion force could be poured onto the continent, a logistical nightmare for the defenders who could neither stop the flow nor effectively counterattack. The crushing weight of these numbers becomes even more significant when contrasted with Germany's own intelligence assessments from just a few years earlier. In 1940, German intelligence had confidently reported that American military production was negligible, estimating it at a paltry 300 planes a month, less than 20 tanks, and practically no military transport vehicles. This was the foundation upon which Hitler's hubris was built. The German command had internalized this fiction, believing America to be an industrial lightweight incapable of projecting significant power. The reality of June 6 shattered that illusion with brutal finality. The nation they had dismissed was now deploying a force whose logistical sophistication and sheer volume of material were beyond anything the German war machine could have conceived, let alone matched. This was more than an invasion, it was the physical manifestation of an industrial and organizational superiority that the German leadership had refused to believe was possible. It was a logistical tidal wave, and it was about to sweep them away. The failure of the German High Command to react decisively on the morning of June 6 cannot be attributed to a lack of intelligence, courage, or military doctrine. The fatal inaction was a symptom of a much deeper institutional disease, a corrosive culture of fear that emanated directly from the top. Adolf Hitler had systematically cultivated a toxic working atmosphere, where absolute loyalty was valued far more than objective truth. Within this system, subordinates understood that their survival and advancement depended not on delivering accurate, unfiltered information, but on managing the Führer's volatile temperament. Delivering bad news was a perilous act, often met with volcanic rage, accusations of defeatism, or summary dismissal. Over time, this created a command structure paralyzed by a singular, overriding imperative: do not anger the Führer. On D-Day, this culture of terrified sycophancy proved to be as formidable an enemy as the Allied armies themselves. This paralysis was most catastrophically demonstrated in the handling of the vital panzer reserves. The man in overall command in the West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, was a seasoned and capable officer, yet on the most critical day of the war, he found his hands tied. The elite panzer divisions, the powerful armored fist that represented the only viable force capable of driving the Allies back into the sea, could not be moved an inch without personal authorization from the Führer. This was not a bureaucratic oversight, it was a deliberate feature of Hitler's leadership style, designed to centralize all key decisions in his own hands and prevent any of his generals from acting with too much independence. On June 6, this strategic bottleneck became a death sentence. While the invasion unfolded, Rundstedt could only watch, powerless to unleash the very forces created for this exact contingency. The key to the entire German defense lay with a man who was asleep and whose staff was too terrified to wake him. The crippling effects of this command structure were quantifiable. As Allied troops fought their way off the beaches and began to consolidate their fragile footholds, a full 12 hours ticked by before Hitler's permission was finally granted to move the 12th SS Panzer Division and the Panzerlehr Division towards the inferno at Cannes. In modern warfare, 12 hours is an eternity. It was time the Allies used to land thousands more men, unload hundreds of tons of equipment, and establish defensive positions. The golden opportunity to strike the invasion force when it was at its most vulnerable, disorganized and exposed on the beaches, was squandered, not because of tactical miscalculation, but because the entire chain of command was waiting for one man to finish his nap. The situation was further complicated by the absence of other key leaders. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the energetic and brilliant commander of Army Group B responsible for the coastal defenses, was on leave at his home in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday. His absence left a vacuum of dynamic leadership on the ground. The system Hitler had built was so brittle and so dependent on a few key individuals that it had no resilience. It could not adapt to the unexpected. The combination of a sleeping Führer, a powerless field marshal, and an absent commander created a perfect storm of indecision. The ultimate psychological portrait of this dysfunction was captured in the haunting words of one of Hitler's adjutants, who later recalled the atmosphere of that morning with chilling clarity. He confessed, "We would rather risk losing the war than wake him up early." This single statement is the definitive epitaph for the leadership culture of the Third Reich. The fear of one man's immediate, personal wrath had become a more potent force than the fear of strategic, irreversible, and national defeat. The German officer corps, famed for its professionalism and initiative, had been reduced to a state of terrified impotence. The war for France was not just lost on the beaches of Normandy, it was lost in the silent, fearful corridors of the Berghof, where the price of waking a dictator was a risk no one was willing to take. The surreal calm at the Berghof was finally broken at 10:00 a.m., as Adolf Hitler emerged from his chambers. The filtered and fragmented news of the invasion was formally presented to him. Yet, this awakening was not a moment of sudden, panicked clarity. Instead, it marked the beginning of a slow, agonizing process of realization, as the Führer's delusional self-confidence collided with the grim and escalating reality from the Normandy coast. The initial German response was not a swift, decisive counterthrust, but a sluggish and confused sequence of events, dictated more by Hitler's insulated worldview and the dysfunctional command structure he had created than by sound military judgment. While the Allies measured their progress in yards of captured beach, the German High Command measured the passing hours in fatal indecision. For 6 critical hours following his awakening, Hitler did not give the one order that mattered most. The armored reserves, the powerful 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and the elite Panzerlehr Division, remained stationary, their engines silent, awaiting the Führer's personal command. During this time, the situation in Normandy was relayed to him, but he continued to perceive the invasion not as the primary Allied effort, but as a possible diversion for a larger, real, invasion to come at the Pas-de-Calais. He held his most potent forces back, caught in a state of strategic paralysis, refusing to commit his trump card to a fight he did not yet believe was the main event. His generals could advise, plead, and present the facts, but the final decision rested with him alone. As the morning bled into the afternoon, the Allied foothold, which might have been crushed by a swift armored assault at dawn, grew stronger and more secure with every passing minute. It was not until 4:00 p.m., a full 10 hours after the first paratroopers had landed and nearly 12 hours after the seaborne assault began, that the Führer finally relented. The order was given: the 12th SS Panzer and Panzerlehr divisions were to move towards Cannes and drive the invaders back into the sea. But the command came catastrophically late. The golden window of opportunity, when the Allied forces were at their most vulnerable on the beaches, had slammed shut. Now, these elite divisions would have to advance in daylight, under skies completely dominated by Allied fighter-bombers, which roamed freely, hunting for any sign of German movement. The advance would be slow, costly, and ultimately insufficient to turn the tide. The belated order was a gesture of response to a battle that had already been strategically lost. As evening descended on June 6, the scale of the Allied achievement and the German failure became starkly, terrifyingly clear. Despite fierce resistance in places like Omaha Beach, the Allies had succeeded beyond their most optimistic projections. More than 150,000 of their soldiers were firmly established on French soil. They had suffered grievous casualties, with approximately 9,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, but they had secured their beachheads. They were no longer a fragile invasion force, they were an army of liberation, digging in, bringing ashore an avalanche of supplies, and preparing to push inland. The Atlantic Wall had been breached not by a trickle, but by a flood. This new reality created an unbridgeable chasm between the orders emanating from the highest levels of command and the capabilities of the German troops on the front line. When Field Marshal Rommel relayed the Führer's expectation to his forces, a furious, unrealistic demand to cleanse the entire beachhead by this evening, he was met with the blunt, despairing truth. The 7th Army, the formation bearing the brunt of the assault, sent back a reply that encapsulated the totality of the disaster. That would be impossible. This was not a statement of insubordination, it was a simple declaration of fact from men who were facing the overwhelming reality of Allied power. The realization was finally dawning throughout the German command structure: the war had irrevocably turned against them, not because of a lack of courage or will, but because their leader had slept through the beginning of the end. The German underestimation of the United States was not merely a failure of battlefield intelligence, it was a profound misunderstanding of the very nature of modern industrial warfare. The same reports that had assured Hitler of America's military insignificance had painted a picture of a consumer-focused economy incapable of a serious pivot to war production. This assessment was not just wrong, it was a fantasy that would soon be shattered by an unprecedented explosion of manufacturing might. The war would ultimately be won not only on the beaches of Normandy but also on the assembly lines of Detroit, in the shipyards of California, and at the riveting stations of Seattle. This was America's industrial revenge, and its unlikeliest and most powerful soldiers were the very women whom German intelligence had dismissed as a sign of national decay. By 1942, long before the first soldier set foot in Normandy, the German leadership's core assumptions had already been rendered obsolete. The United States was not just producing war material, it was churning out thousands of tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels at a rate that dwarfed the combined output of Germany and Japan. The nation that German analysts had mocked for its focus on consumer goods had seamlessly transitioned its legendary capacity for mass production to the tools of war. This was a transformation of a magnitude the rigid, state-controlled German economy could not begin to comprehend, let alone match. The numbers were simply staggering. In the single year of 1943, American shipyards launched more than 1,000 new ships, a fleet built in 12 months that could challenge the naval power of any nation on Earth. This wasn't just production, it was a deluge, an avalanche of steel that was arming not only American forces but also bolstering the arsenals of its allies across the globe. The secret to this industrial miracle, and the ultimate refutation of Nazi ideology, was the mobilization of American women. German intelligence, viewing the world through its own distorted lens of patriarchal Nazism, had identified the increasing presence of women in American factories as a fundamental weakness of the labor force. To them, it was a sign of desperation, proof that America was running out of able-bodied men. This was a catastrophic misreading born of ideological blindness. They could not conceive that a nation could draw strength from its entire population, unshackled by the rigid gender roles they championed. What they saw as a symptom of weakness was, in fact, America's single greatest strategic advantage in the war of production. As millions of American men went to the front lines, millions of American women stepped onto the factory floors, picking up rivet guns and welding torches to build the arsenal of democracy. This unlocked a vast, untapped reservoir of talent, dedication, and productivity that the Third Reich, with its Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church, ideology for women, had willingly left dormant. This mobilization of female labor allowed the United States to perform a feat no other nation could, simultaneously field a massive, multi-front military force and massively increase its industrial output. The perceived weakness was a force multiplier of unimaginable power. The ultimate irony of history lay in the direct comparison of output. The very American women whose presence in factories was deemed a sign of weakness by German intelligence were demonstrating a productive capacity that was humiliatingly superior. The output of these women and their male colleagues was so immense that, in a cruel twist of fate for the Third Reich, American factories were producing more military equipment in a single month than the entire German war economy could manufacture in a quarter. Hitler's regime was being buried, methodically and relentlessly, under a mountain of war goods built by the hands of people it had written off as culturally and racially inferior. The laughter in Berchtesgaden had been definitively silenced by the roar of American factories, a roar powered by the resolve of a nation that had turned its supposed weakness into the engine of its victory. The Third Reich's fatal underestimation of America was a twofold delusion. First came the dismissal of its industrial power, an illusion shattered by the avalanche of steel that supported the D-Day landings. Second, and just as critical, was the profound contempt for the American soldier himself. To the battle-hardened German officer corps, steeped in a Prussian martial tradition that prized iron discipline and ideological fervor, the American GI was a laughable amateur. They saw him not as a warrior, but as a soft, undisciplined product of a decadent capitalist society, more interested in chewing gum and listening to jazz than in the grim science of warfare. This brittle arrogance, however, would not survive contact with the enemy. The war in France and beyond would provide a final, bitter education, forcing a painful evolution in German perception from smug disdain to a grudging, despairing respect. In the initial stages of the conflict, German military leaders were confident that their tactical and spiritual superiority would easily overcome America's numerical and material advantages. Their early assessments seemed to confirm this bias. High-ranking officers consistently characterized American troops as inexperienced and fatally prone to panic. This view was articulated with chilling confidence by Colonel General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who, after encountering U.S. forces in North Africa, confidently asserted that American soldiers quickly fall into a panic under intense pressure. This was not an outlier opinion. It was the prevailing wisdom within the Wehrmacht. They believed the American fighting man lacked the psychological fortitude and the rigorous training to stand up to the veterans of the Eastern Front. They expected American resolve to crumble in the face of the blitzkrieg tactics that had conquered Europe. However, the grinding reality of sustained combat following D-Day began to systematically dismantle this illusion. The Americans, while certainly suffering from inexperience in their initial engagements, proved to be remarkably fast learners. They were adaptable, well-equipped, and possessed a fighting spirit that German commanders had not anticipated. The most visceral clash between the old German arrogance and the new reality was captured in a legendary, heated exchange between Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and the head of the Luftwaffe, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring. Rommel, facing the relentless Allied onslaught in Normandy, voiced the desperate truth of the frontline commander: the enemy is winning his battles from the air. They destroy my tanks with American armor-piercing shells. Göring, insulated in his remote headquarters and completely cocooned in denial, responded with the voice of pure Nazi hubris. "That's impossible," he bellowed. "The Americans only know how to make razor blades." His reply was the perfect encapsulation of the regime's ideology, a sneering dismissal of American consumer industry as proof of its military impotence. Rommel's retort was lethally sharp, a bitter acknowledgement of the deadly effectiveness of that very industry. "We could use some of those razor blades, Herr Reichsmarschall." In that single, sarcastic sentence, the entire German delusion was exposed and condemned. The razor blades were destroying his panzer divisions, and the high command refused to see it. By the end of the war, the evidence was undeniable, even to German military analysts. The panicky amateurs had evolved into a seasoned and effective fighting force. In a stunning reversal of initial expectations, post-war modeling of battlefield engagements revealed that American infantry units, by the conflict's conclusion, were winning their encounters against their German counterparts in 54% of cases. This statistic was the final nail in the coffin of German military arrogance. The American soldier, backed by overwhelming firepower and possessing a resilience the Wehrmacht never thought possible, had achieved tactical superiority. The journey from being dismissed as a panicked amateur to being recognized as a victorious adversary was complete, and for the German command, it was the final, devastating collapse of a worldview built on lies. The story of the Second World War is one of ideologies in collision, of nations in arms, and of battles that decided the fate of humanity. But at its core, it is also a story of human fallibility, and no single human flaw proved more catastrophic than Adolf Hitler's hubris. His profound, racially fueled underestimation of the United States was not merely a footnote to the conflict, it was the central, fatal miscalculation upon which his entire global strategy would ultimately founder and break. The final, bloody chapter of the Third Reich is the story of this arrogance coming home to roost, a testament to the historical lesson that contempt for an adversary is the surest path to one's own destruction. The dominoes of Germany's defeat began to fall not on the beaches of Normandy, but 2.5 years earlier, with a decision born of pure ideological arrogance. In December 1941, in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler chose to declare war on the United States, an act he was not bound to by treaty. This is now almost universally regarded as Hitler's greatest strategic mistake. It was a decision made not out of strategic necessity but out of a profound belief that America was a degenerate, internally fractured nation that posed no serious long-term threat. He willingly opened a new front against an industrial behemoth he did not respect, inviting a conflict he could not possibly win. In that moment, he signed his own death warrant. The only question was when and how the sentence would be carried out. Operation Overlord was the execution of that sentence. The D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, represented the inevitable consequence of Hitler's 1941 decision. The industrial giant he had awakened and derided had finally brought its full, terrifying power to his doorstep. From that day forward, the conflict entered a new phase. Overlord was the definitive, turning point, after which the defeat of Germany became inevitable. The successful establishment of a second front in France crushed the Wehrmacht between the Soviet hammer in the east and the Anglo-American anvil in the west. The war became a slow, agonizing bleed, a war of attrition that Germany, with its depleted resources and shattered cities, could not hope to win against an enemy that seemed to possess an inexhaustible supply of men and machines. The final, bitter irony of Hitler's hubris played out in the spring of 1945, in the subterranean gloom of his Berlin bunker. As the Red Army closed in from the east, the thunder of American artillery and the rumble of approaching American tanks echoed from the west. In those final, desperate days, one can imagine the Führer, trapped beneath the rubble of his capital, listening to the reports of his collapsing empire. It is here that the narrative comes full circle. Did he, in those moments, recall that bright June morning in 1944 when he had overslept the beginning of the end? Did he remember his own confident pronouncements about the half-Judaized, half-negrified nation that was now at the very gates of his chancellery? The Americans he had so viciously despised, the products of a society he deemed rotten to its core, were now a primary instrument of his destruction. Their victory was not just a military defeat for Germany, it was a total, ideological refutation of everything he stood for. By May 1945, the price of his arrogance had been paid in full. Berlin lay in ruins, a moonscape of shattered stone and twisted steel. The Führer himself was dead, having taken his own life rather than face the humiliation of capture. His 1,000-year Reich had lasted a mere 12 years, and his grandiose, ambitious goals had turned to ash. The man who had once laughed at the American army had been silenced forever, his empire crushed under the weight of an industrial and military power he had been too blind with prejudice to ever truly see.